On Perspective this week, MHKs Joney, Faragher and Daphne Caine ponder the slow pace with which successive governments deliver meaningful change to our lives. The Climate Change Transformation Board seems to be just another talking shop, but as we'll hear in the second part of the programme, Daphne Caine thinks it plays an important role. But first, I caught up with Joney Faragher at the grandstand earlier this week, and she wasn't there for the races.
The UK charity, the Baton of Hope, has travelled over to the island yesterday on the boat, and we met them this afternoon. Well, we met them this morning actually, and we've been. They've launched the Baton of Hope initiative, which is a sort of UK-wide, nationwide suicide prevention initiative, and the Baton will be travelling around 12 cities in the UK, and they've actually chosen the Isle of Man to launch it. We've been walking around the paddock trying to raise awareness first of all of what the Baton of Hope is doing, opening up those conversations, as well as getting some donations to kick off the charity. So it really is, it's a big deal that they've started their initiative here on the Isle of Man. If you look at the statistics, I think we would have to concede that there's more that we can do, but I think that's exactly what the strategy was about and why the suicide prevention group was actually formed. And it's a public health coordinated initiative, the suicide prevention group, and what we've drawn up in terms of the strategy looks at local data, so it really is very Isle of Man specific. It's what is happening here in terms of data, in terms of demographics, methods people use, potential groups that we could target in order to sort of try to bring our suicide rate down, how we can help people look to better outcomes in their life and feel like their life is actually on a good track, and that it's worth living, really. So there's so many strands, I suppose, to suicide prevention, and it is actually quite challenging to say whether the government is doing it. I think at this point in time we're not, but I think the strategy brings us in line with doing a lot more and what we should be doing. And the final result of my motion, after quite an emotional debate actually, and lengthy debate, the final result was that all departments will go away, look at the strategy, determine which actions are for them, and identify the resources and funding that they need in order to complete that action. So I do feel like at this point there is investment in this strategy and in suicide prevention overall.
We're nearly 2 years into the Caine administration. We have a bold, glitzy plan that's been developed. Tynwald members seem to be behind the plan, but I think a lot of the public, certainly the ones that I speak to, wonder when the plan is actually going to start being fulfilled. There's an awful lot of talk, an awful lot of promises, but perhaps not as much action as many people would have hoped by now.
Yeah, I hear that as well when speaking with constituents, etc. I think that there are two areas in which I would really, really like us to see some really tangible strides forwards, and that's housing and climate change. And I feel that these are the two that, every single person in that court, in Tynwald Court, every single MHK was elected on a platform of looking at the housing crisis and doing something about it. And it feels like there's some we've formed the Housing Communities Board, and they've been meeting, but what actual tangible action and an impact upon housing prices and upon young people's ability to get on the housing ladder or rent somewhere in an affordable way has that had? And I don't see at the moment very much impact whatsoever, and I think that's all that people care about at the end of it. It doesn't matter that it's complex or that they're meeting every month. We want to see the action, and I think it's the same with climate change. So if we look at, we've heard a lot about getting some wind turbines turbines, but where are they? Where's that action on that? When can we expect them? What date? We're standing here in the backdrop of the grandstand and the TT races going on there, and we know that we've offset this with the positive group again this year. But you know what the best offset would be? Would be having some onshore wind turbines, wouldn't it? So I would love to see some strides forward in those two areas, and I really hope that we're going to see that in the next 3 years.
Well, I seem to recall, sadly, as one of the ministers responsible making bold promises that we would see real action on renewable energy. I think it was by 2016, and of course the timescales came and went, and we're still where we are. Is Tynwald capable of pushing forward, actually driving forward the radical change that you particularly are interested in?
Is it capable? Yes. But is the will there? And I think that's always underlying everything. And I personally feel like the structure of the Council of Ministers, in which meetings aren't minuted, and huge decisions about climate targets and about whether we should have interim targets are not made in an accountable manner. I think if actually every single one of those members had to account to the public for the fact that they for the way that they voted. So if they, for example, they wanted to go for the further away target or the weaker target, I think we might actually see some bigger steps forward. And so I think in some ways, yes, the structure of Tynwald actually potentially holds us back a little bit in terms of taking bolder strides forward, because the person who's Conservative with a little c, the person who feels a little bit more concerned and wants to have a bigger review, they'll be holding back the bolder members, and yet there'll be no accountability for that. So capable, yes. Is the will there at the moment? I'm not convinced.
So you're not convinced that the bold targets in the government plan are fully embraced by all the ministers?
I mean, I suppose I have to say that they are, because they're in the plan. But I feel like there's a sort of lack of urgency behind that. We know that we have these targets, and in order to meet them, we needed to see quite bold and an urgent drive towards acting on those. And I feel, I suppose, at this point that we haven't really seen that drive. And it's the same in both of the areas that I've spoken about. Housing, we know we need to do something about that. And but what are we what are we tangibly doing? What exactly are we doing to help our young people and our older people in terms of people who want to downsize, what they call last-time buyers? What are we actually doing across the board to help people live in affordable housing and not actually be in basically rent poverty or mortgage poverty? And I don't see strides in that, and it's exactly the same in terms of our climate targets. I had a motion in order to bring our target forward, which was rejected by the Council of Ministers. So I'm not convinced, no, that we have in those two areas that we're meeting on. However, I will provide a bit of balance and say that there are other areas in which, so for example, what we spoke about earlier, the suicide prevention strategy, had real tangible support from the Council of Ministers. So there are areas in which we are taking strides.
In terms then of housing, I know, because I had a brief spell as a housing minister, that the rule of unintended consequences is quite high. You make one action somewhere and solve a particular problem in one area, but then other problems arise that you perhaps hadn't foreseen. Is it right to spend a good while properly considering which policies should be implemented, and if not, what are the actions that you would have been expecting in the course of the last 2 years? What would you have expected to have seen that would make a big difference?
I suppose the biggest one would be in the Department for Infrastructure's departmental plan that they laid before Tynwald. there was absolutely no plan whatsoever to build any more social housing. Now, what we have done is we are looking at increasing the threshold for people to be able to apply for social housing. But, for example, in my constituency, Douglas East and Douglas across the board, the housing waiting lists are already straining at the seams. They're already huge. So all we will do, if we increase thresholds, more people can apply, all we will do is make longer waiting lists, unless we are also in tandem building additional social housing. So I think with the demand being so high, I really feel like that's one action that we could be looking at, is building additional social housing. And yet there's no plans to do so. We don't hear anything about our social housing portfolio and what plans in terms of maintenance. Just down the road there, where you've got Marathon Terrace, just down Victoria Road, that there are several houses completely empty because they're not maintained properly and they need work done on them. Where's the plan to deal with this? And there is low-hanging fruit. You're absolutely right that it would be right to assess the situation, but there's always quick wins, and we haven't even done those.
And of course the assumption is that the previous administration had not done any work on this, because had the work been done, you'd imagine that the New Housing and Communities Board would have been able to hit the ground running and start taking the necessary actions.
I think that's one of the things that we seem to be hearing a lot in this administration. It seems to be that lots of issues have been kind of kicked down the can and haven't been tackled for years and years and years, and now we're having to play catch up. They're all kind of come to a head in this administration. Whether that is actually the case or not, it seems to me like it is, I have to say. But yeah, so it feels like we are dealing with a lot of legacy issues and having to play catch up.
And I suppose then finally the big climate related issue at the moment, of course, is the e-bus. One of your colleagues in the House of Keys, John Wannenberg, has described this as virtue signalling. Is that a fair charge, do you think?
No, I don't think that's a fair charge at all. Any steps that we make in order to make our public transport more future-proof is laudable, as far as I'm concerned, and I think it's unhelpful to call it anything but.
A bit of bandwagging, e-bandwagging. Oh gosh, try to say this again. A bit of e-bandwagon. I'm struggling with this. A bit of e-bandwagon jumping, would you suggest? On
the part of DOI or on the part of John? Potentially. I mean, obviously John's my colleague. I'm sure he thought it through before he said it. However, I just don't think that he's taken into account the 360 picture there.
And of course there is a full lifetime calculation which seems to suggest that this would be significantly cheaper than paying for a cheaper bus, but then having to pay for the more expensive fuel.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen that Go Green have done a sort of analysis, a numerical analysis on what it would cost if we electrified our fleet. And they've got quite a high figure of what we would save over the next 10 years. So first of all, it would be helping us achieve our climate targets. But secondly, it does appear that it would save us money in the longer run. And do you know what? We really have to start thinking in the longer run and stop this political short-termism. It is really crippling us. And actually, if we look to the long term and think, what will be the best for my children in 15 years' time, that's how we're going to solve issues.
And of course, going back to the point I made about being a minister, making various promises. What are we, 7 years ago, we were supposed to have been seeing significant progress. We're now being told that the significant progress will come at the end of this administration. In the meantime, we have some of the most poorly insulated homes, certainly in these islands, and we could very simply introduce schemes that would help people significantly improve the insulation in their homes. That would save vast sums of money, as well as reducing the amount of energy we use.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And it's a really hard equation, actually, because we're struggling with which comes first, really. There's sort of just chicken and egg situation here, where we really need to get homes insulated and make the island a more attractive, lower cost of living place to be, to attract young people over here. But we need those young people over here to pay for the actions that we need to take. So we're kind of in this, a little bit stuck in this equation at the moment. And I think at some point, as I have said numerous times in Tynwald, we are going to have to actually make that call and be bold. And otherwise we're just going to go further and further down the line of not being appealing and not managing to attract people. And although it's hard and it's risky, I think that if we don't make the call at some point, we're going to get stuck even more so than we are. So yeah, I think we have to be bold.
That was Joney Faragher, MHK. So what does Daphne Caine think of the proposed new site for the sewage works in Laxey?
I think it's a massive win for Best for Laxey and the community of Laxey and those who enjoy the tourist amenity of Old Laxey, that MU abandoned its plans to site the treatment works adjacent to the harbour. So wherever they go beyond that, pumping out of the village was a given. So they say they've looked at 50 sites, and I'm not entirely convinced that it's logical to pump the sewage all the way up 160 metres to Axenfell Plantation, but that is their preferred site. So yes, it's a big win on the original proposal, but in my head, it would be more logical to pump away to Mary Veg, which is the standard sewage treatment, so it's a more effective end result. But I have a series of written questions in to explore, what are the limitations of the current system. We know, for instance, that they never installed the pumping station at Quarterbridge. So does that have a bearing on the capacity of Onchan to be able to accommodate the sewage coming out of Laxey and Bodrine? So it's just everybody, I think, is agreed that we want to stop pumping raw sewage out to sea, but how effectively is that being done, and what is the best way forward? I look forward to the environmental impact assessments being completed and Manx Utilities coming back with a fully worked up scheme.
So at the moment, it's merely a proposal. This is a potential site, or is this MUA have agreed that this is the site, and no matter how much shouting and lobbying from the constituency, that's where it's going to go?
I'm aware that Garth commissioners have expressed reservations. They have met with the Auditor General, newly appointed, Stephen Warren, and I believe he is also going to meet after TT with Manx Utilities to go through their current proposal. In the meantime, on Manx Utilities' own website, they post fortnightly updates as to where they are in the process, and in conversations with them they have indicated that this is the best location they have been able to find, and it's in the section which is a little bit lower down in Axenfell, closer to the properties, which isn't particularly pleasing to the nearby residents, but they say environmentally, that's from the DEFA who own the site, from the ecological impacts, environmental impact assessments will be ongoing, but they think that this is the best location they could find that is in government ownership.
The new works should be relatively odour-free?
Well, they should be. They're going to fit odour control as standard, but it's the IRBC, so these rotational bioreactors or biocontactors. It's a scheme and a system that they've rolled out over several communities across the Isle of Man. We have them in Portlague. I'm aware there's some in the middle of Glenvine across the Heritage Trail. But the one just north of Ramsey at Balladool is having odour issues, but obviously is much further out of the tourist amenity and the beaches of Ramsey. So there are significant concerns, I would say, that there is no guarantee that with the odour control there won't be any. The other issue from what's best for Laxey and best for the island is that the traditional sewage farm that you get at Mary Veg and Port Erin and Ports of Mary that have been pumped for 20 years now to the All-Iris, the All-Island Integrated Sewage Treatment, is the old-fashioned system, but it's well out of the way of causing any odour issues for neighbouring properties, whereas this is the IRBC's is only, I think, 85% efficient. It requires twice daily, every weekday, I think Manx Utilities has now said, trucking the solids away all the way down to Meriveg. So for the sake of 4.5 kilometres from Baldrine to Onken to join in with the Iris scheme, it does seem hard to take that this is the best scheme with all the number of pumping stations required, and then to get it 60 metres above the main road area, to go higher up to an IRBC treatment with daily trucking rather than a more efficient scheme that takes it all away unseen, pumped under the ground to an all-island treatment site that is 100% efficient. So that's the bit I look forward to, the complete scheme coming back from Manx Utilities. But yes, I appreciate that they have spent several years investigating 50 different locations, and they are very insistent with all the information they have that this is the best scheme for Laxey. And I'd say from a beach user's perspective and those in Old Laxey, it is a win that there isn't going to be a treatment works in Old Laxey.
And in terms of Iris, the sewage treatment works that currently are used by the vast majority of people in the Isle of Man. Is it still the highest electricity user in the island?
I think there is a significant amount of electricity use. You'd have to ask Manx Utilities for what the actual breakdown is. But from Laxey sea level, in Old Laxey, in the conservation area, up to the main road, and I think it's about 100 metres, and then you're talking an additional 60 metres straight uphill to Axenfeld Plantation instead of carrying along on the more level and then dropping down again to Meriveg. So which way you pump it, there is still going to be electrical use, and obviously the benefit from the decarbonisation of our electricity supply by 2030 will be that won't be producing carbon emissions to quite the same level. But yes, there's always going to be an expensive pump away wherever it's pumped to, because it's not suitable to be treated in the heart of an Old Laxey conservation area.
And then I suppose the obvious question is, you are chair of the Climate Transformation Board. Is there no thought as to how some possibly even use of the methane created from the sewage treatment works, that this in some way could be used to generate electricity to perhaps reduce the vast reliance on fossil fuel generated electricity for this Iris programme?
I would love that to be the case, but I think that's anaerobic digestion, and I don't think it can be done in a commercially viable way that is appropriate for the island and the amounts of the locations where we have it to where it would need to be. And it is the more traditional route, sewage beds, if you like, at Meriveg. But we are looking at what are the methods of, particularly for farming use and biofuel, biomass. We're looking at all sorts of aspects of what would be appropriate in the Isle of Man context to generate electricity for the future. But that really rests with the energy strategy that DEFRA is working up as our Department of the Environment, Food and Agriculture, and also in conjunction with Manx Utilities. And it's a massive change for the Isle of Man that we're considering across climate change, across every aspect of how we live, travel and work. So it's a massive planning process to achieve that behavioural change in a way that is looking beyond the normal 5-year short-termism of elections to the 2050 commitment that we have to achieve net zero in 30 years' time.
One of the other elements to your role, perhaps, is climate adaptation. Mitigation is one thing. This is the ways in which we can find to reduce the amount of carbon we pump into the atmosphere. But another important element, even if, as a number of people on the Isle of Man still seem to be in this position of not believing that climate change is a man-made thing, even if you don't believe that, what is happening, somehow the climate is changing, and that results in water falling from the sky more quickly, which results in flooding. back at the end of not the last administration, but the administration before that, there was something like £200 million worth of necessary flood defences identified by the then Department of Infrastructure. And you've got 5 million left for the next 3-4 years.
Indeed. Well, there was much talk 2 years ago when the budget, the headline figure was £42 million on climate change. That wasn't all to go into the Climate Change Transformation Board. We have a fund of £25 million that is being held over because a lot of it is allocated. About £20 million of that is allocated to directly assist people in their own home and their mitigations in the energy efficiency scheme and in the Green Living Grant scheme. But we know it is not going to be fully committed. It's not going to be fully spent. So we are already reviewing when we close those schemes and when we go to something more targeted potentially. The 9 million of that 42 million figure was actually in the Department of Infrastructure's hands in terms of coastal sea defences, for instance. And yes, in the flood, I think Laxey itself, having suffered 2 devastating floods within 5 years, Laxey has had a significant amount of that £9 million spent on it, and probably will exceed £10 or £12 million over the coming years because of all the elements it needs. But work is also ongoing from a land management, land use change perspective higher up in the hills. They're looking at peat restoration, which can reduce the flooding that is suffered lower down in the valleys. We've got the Blue Carbon Project, which is another aspect mentioned in the progress report after a year. There's significant work ongoing. Carbon sequestration, where you capture it, and there's such important work going on that the Isle of Man is achieving amazing things, but it's frustratingly slow. And it's also because of the significant amount of planning that we do, along with infrastructure in terms of where their priorities are for the next sea defences. Well, they were looking at one point of the seawall at Laxey. That's all gone very quiet. And again at Ramsey, the kayaker in the streets of Ramsey, we all need to have prioritised work undertaken to protect people and property and business against what is a very changing climate with more dramatic and significant rainfall events more frequently.
You mentioned there the progress report, and of course this is going to be considered at this month's TINMLD, at the June TINMLD. The progress report makes quite head in hand sort of reading when it comes to those of us who've been engaged with politics for a long time, because so much of what's being suggested, and at least some of it is now work in progress, seems to have been on government's agenda for probably the last 3, maybe 4 administrations. What is it about government? What is it about the whole processes of government that make everything so difficult to actually deliver?
Well, first of all, you have politics, and then you have departmental priorities, and you have a business as usual element to departments having to do what they do. And climate mitigation, climate change is a massive change programme. It affects every aspect of our lives. Increasingly, we see from the progress report and what is being rolled out as the duty on public bodies to put climate change at the heart of all their policies. They're going to have public body reporting duties. They're going to have to assess what their emissions are and how they're going to plan to reduce those over time. But what we find in the significant areas is we as the Climate Board, which ourselves struggled because it went down from 12 to 2.5 staff equivalents, and we're now building that up. I think we're now back up to a team of 8. But we are having to put posts within, for instance, the infrastructure department to progress key elements of our climate plan, which are involving transport decarbonisation, which is one of the 3 big areas, but also the waste strategy. And it's interesting, another item on the TINMLD order paper relates to the Environment and Infrastructure Committee's report on active travel, and that is still something that these things don't happen without dedicated people to do them, and there aren't the staff available within the departments quite often to do these new things. And politically, they're not popular, I would say. They're not people pleasers, except for a small amount of people who contact me very anxious about the progress, the rate of climate mitigations that we are managing to implement. But from my side, it was incredibly frustrating as the year with some really dedicated, hard-working people. But then we see in the progress report, actually, we have made a few strides forward. We have made some significant milestones. Government does have an act which we are complying with to bring this. You know, it's not Daphne Caine saying you will have these changes made to your life. We're saying we have to adapt to changes that are happening all around us. And from a business and perspective and the future population, we must make these changes to enable the Isle of Man to thrive into the future, but in a low carbon way.
Does government, and I'm not limiting you now in terms of an answer to the Climate Change Transformation Board, but does government generally have a habit of being busy doing things, many of which don't really seem to have much of a direct impact on people's lives? Busy checking things, busy writing reports, busy developing strategies, and yet we still have a housing crisis. We still have some of the worst insulated homes, which it's such an easy, quick fix, you would think, to get better insulation across the properties of the island. What do you think it is about government that means that these things just seem to take forever?
Part of it is the political process. And when I'm saying there's £25 million headline fund, that we're now in the second year of allocation, and there's, I think, £11 million carried over. So the total funding, if you like, as it says in the progress report, is £36 million for the Climate Board and the initiatives that we're looking to roll out. But a lot of our time, for instance, we've just commissioned in February Sistra to do the transport decarbonisation scenarios. So we engage, as we did with renewable home heating, experts in their field, that's the GemServe report, which is available already on the website, to look at the possible options for the Isle of Man and what works the best in the island context.
Shouldn't we be past looking at options, though? I mean, so much of what's in that report, I recognise from my time as chair of the Infrastructure and Environment Committee of Council of Ministers, these things are known. Why are we not just cracking on and making the things happen?
Well, we don't own that budget. We, as a board, prepare the business cases, and we have to go before the Treasury Board, and we have to secure the funding and the approval before going out and spending the money. So we have to be very sure, with big amounts of public money, that we are spending it in the most effective way we can. And that comes down to, shortly, we've been looking at biomass as a possible for instance, agricultural enterprise and energy source. And that report I think is coming out in the next week or so. It's going to be very informative how we move forward. But we don't own all those strategies. We're almost the facilitator at the centre, trying to collaborate with all the various departments. Should it be quicker? Should we have more funding? There are so many, as you've said, priorities for government, and housing is absolutely up there. But let's think that we should be moving to the future home standards. So we've just had the consultation on bringing forward the traditional boiler ban going into new dwellings, and the consultation on that is also going to be out in the next few weeks. It's very hard to gear up both the people to be on board with the new technologies, if you like, and also to get the essential construction workers and the qualified people to make the installations of the new technology. So we're working across the board with the construction industry, with the agricultural industry, and so many elements of it. It is massive, and we probably don't have enough resources in it. And I think there is a sea change, though, across. When I think back to when I started in Parliament in 2016 to 2019, when I tabled the First Amendment to declare the climate crisis, to now, where we've got the Climate Act in place and we have public body duty and we have all departments looking at this and assessing it and collaborating on it, it is slow to turn tankers around and to go to EVs and to get the necessary infrastructure in. But in some ways, we are much more geared up and aligned and coordinated than parts of the UK, particularly rural parts, where you look at, in conjunction with Manx Utilities, we have got as an island just over 1,000 electric vehicles now registered, and we've got well over 100, it was 113 a couple of months ago, electric chargers, public chargers. So we are keeping pace 1 to 10, so that those ones on the promenade, and working with the DOI to take off the time limit out of daytime hours, so that people who don't have off-road parking can consider taking on electric vehicles as a future mode of transport that would suit their lives. But there is also that aspect that some people don't use a car and don't want to use a car. And in the future, active travel, or if you're within a 2.5 mile radius, could you go by bike more? Could you walk more? Do you need to have a 2-car family for the future? And I think the younger generation is definitely open to the idea that we will live our lives differently in the future. And some of the frustration, and some of it's intergenerational fairness, the cost of doing something now, and what's the cost of not doing it now, the escalated costs in the future, not only financial terms, but business terms, reputational terms for the Isle of Man. I think the Isle of Man has the opportunity to do something really special in climate adaptation.
Does the Climate Change Board work? I'm not saying this in a derogatory way about any of the people on the board, but I think it was established with a big fanfare that these different boards, the Housing and Communities Board, the Climate Change Board, the Tourism Board, but a certain member decided he didn't want to be the chair of that, so that didn't happen. But the two boards, it certainly appears from outside observer position that the boards are frustrated that they aren't getting necessarily the level of cooperation they need from the various departments. Government, the Chief Minister has made very clear that he's not interested in single legal entity status for government. So effectively, each individual department remains as a legislative silo. The question, does the Climate Change Board work?
Well, I suppose how I see it is we are there to break through the silos. We are there to work collaboratively with all the departments. The Department of Home Affairs is particularly on board and geared up and moving forward in the solar panels, I think, for the masts up here at Douglas Head, but also assessing all their buildings, reducing their carbon footprint, looking to the future in terms of the fleet that they operate. That's key person in there, I suppose, the Minister, Jane Paul Wilson, and Rob Mercer, I would say. But in other departments, we have the Minister of Infrastructure who sits on the board, and we have the Environment Minister, Claire Barber, sitting on the board, along with Paul Caine, who is well versed in the science. And on top of that, we have appointed our sector experts, if you like. So we've got the expert advisor on decarbonisation of our energy supply, and we also have our expert advisor on renewable home heating, and they have enormous knowledge of their areas, and they are inputting to the board. So we are better able to understand all the aspects and to drive policy, and hopefully to bring people on that journey with us in a positive way to move forward. And it is a less polluting, low carbon future that we all need to go on. But yes, it's frustrating and not dismissing at all. The housing crisis is so very real, but what I would like to see is more of the developers more willingly to accommodate future home standards in all the designs, and also the no fossil fuel boilers in new dwellings. I mean, that's an imperative for me to happen as soon as it possibly can, because we're talking about potentially lowering bills, lowering pollution, and better homes, warmer, more efficient housing.
And these are things that politicians can influence. I remember having a conversation when I was involved still in government with a prominent developer who said, well, you change the regulations, we'll comply with them. They didn't feel as though they had a problem, and indeed they were concerned to a certain extent that the standards hadn't been raised quickly enough. So I mean, it's in your hands as politicians, isn't it?
It is, but we have to do it in collaboration. I mean, developers, I really enjoyed seeing, I think it's Hertford Homes developments up in Ramsey that are planned, and they are going ahead with their source heat pumps as standard. There's no imperative in place legally for them at the minute, but there is an absolute date in mind that by the 1st of January 2025, no fossil fuel boiler can be installed in a new dwelling. And whether planning has been issued or obtained, that's an imperative that will be there. And we are now working with planning, building control, the team writing to everybody who may have live planning approval to advise them of this date that not everybody is aware of, and it might have a bearing on the future. There are some exceptions in place which will be advised as well. But why wouldn't you want a non-fossil fuel boiler? Why would you want to have the volatility of gas prices or oil in the future? Why wouldn't you want a clean system by 2030? We're not talking everybody to do it this month. We're talking over the next decade. By 2030-ish, we will have decarbonised electricity. So an electric system is going to be better for the environment, better for the individual, and probably on a par in terms of the cost now. I've been talking to people who have gone on the Manx Utilities interest-free 10-year installation of an air source heat pump, and they are delighted because our research shows well over 80%, I think Mia's just brought out in the UK, over 80% of people are satisfied equally with air source heat pump to the old traditional boiler. And on the island, we've live cases that we will be putting up on our website netzero.im soon. We have case studies where people are pleased with the results. The houses are warm, and also they're paying what they were paying in paying back the interest-free loan for the installation, what they were paying in gas 2 years ago, significantly saving on what they could be paying right now.
Talk to us about the science. Because for every long-serving, well-considered scientist, there seems to be half a dozen conspiracy theorists with varying degrees of views that basically say that this is all a climate hoax. It's all made up, and actually we're being forced to improve the world in which we live by way of getting rid of pollution for no apparent reason. How do you respond to that? I mean, is there any doubt in terms of the science?
I would say not. I'd say the science is very clear that it is human activity over the last 200 years that is increasing our carbon emissions into the atmosphere and is causing devastating climate change. You say we may not see the extremes of it on this island, and yet we know that last year was the warmest on record here and in the UK. Since 1980s, every decade has been warmer than the previous one. And from, I suppose, just in recent news, New York having to abandon a play because the atmosphere was so bad because of the smoke cloud that has drifted down from the wildfires devastating Canada. And you look at, there's been cyclone in Burma, Bangladesh. I think there's 200 million people displaced at the minute out of the world's population. That will only increase. And when you've got food security, the ability, the whole biodiversity comes into this, and the ability of pollinators to keep our food supplies both on the island and internationally. Looking at the future, can we grow enough food for populations? What will we do when there's 200 million people trying to get into Europe because whole swathes of the southern hemisphere are uninhabitable, suffering drought, the deserts extending? And then you look at what's happening in the acidification of the oceans. If we don't look after our seas, which on the Isle of Man we are significantly ahead with our marine nature reserves. Now we've got 10 or 10%, and there is a bid to say that really the world should be looking at 30% by 2030. We are considering all the science around us. It's not really for me. I'm not a scientist, but I would say that the IPCC latest report that says the world is not on track actually to limit global temperature to 1.5 degrees, and they've already said that the devastation will increase if we don't manage to keep it to that. 782 scientists contributed to that report. 66,000 studies are peer-reviewed. So now in the world, 99% of scientists agree that it's human activity that is causing climate change. And who am I to disagree? But yes, you'll always find the 1%. And if you want to listen to the 1% and you want to close your ears and your mind to what's going on around the world, that's fine. But then from an Isle of Man business perspective, the Isle of Man becomes uninvestable if we don't take these climate measures, because the rest of our world says that we need to do this, we need to decarbonise. And actually the emissions per person on the Isle of Man are some of the highest in the Western world. So even though we don't have any industry here, we need to drive those down so the Isle of Man becomes more investable. And I suppose my vision for 2030 and beyond would be that we're not only the Isle of Man, green hills by the sea, we are Green Island in a wonderful blue, clear ocean and a beacon of the biosphere, saying we are doing everything we can for our island and the planet.
Are we, though, green in terms of green wet behind the ears? Are we virtue signalling? Are we just keen to jump on the latest international fad? And certainly as one of your colleagues, John Wallenberg, has suggested, things like the e-bus trial is virtue signalling. Is that fair?
I would say no. I think it's a fair point, and I know it's an opinion that a section of the community would support. But even if you think that, even if you think it's ridiculous that we would look at a bus costing £500,000, I would say that we need to invest in our public transport. Whether I'm concerned that no new buses have been purchased for several years now, because having a past worked in public transport, it's the network that we have across the island is very important, and the maintenance of old buses increases, the likelihood of breakdown increases when they're not renewed, and the more modern buses are less polluting. That is true. But if we could have buses that run on batteries, that are powered by electricity that is decarbonised, and therefore they're not polluting, then of course we should be gearing up, especially to a future where eventually fossil fuel burning vehicles aren't going to be available in so many numbers in the future.
And of course this also then ties in with a motion that David Ashford has down, a general debate about energy security. At the moment, it's fair to say, the vast majority of energy, if not almost all the energy the Isle of Man consumes, is imported.
Well, we've got obviously the combined gas cycle power station at Pulrose, which is using significant amount of gas to power our electricity, and we have one undersea cable, the interconnector, which can bring in a significant amount of our power. Manx Utility are gearing up to look at the feasibility of a second interconnector.
I suppose the question, though, maybe the question that I would have hoped that David Ashford might have given us a hint to is energy security for the Isle of Man, is that even important?
Well, there's two things. Energy security means the lights, we don't have blackouts, and we've got a very fantastic record of not having blackouts across the island over the past 20 years. But energy security and energy independence are different things. And in fact, who has energy independence? How independent, how secure is it when it relies on a gas pipeline with the volatility of gas supply and prices? So the planning that I've been involved in a small way, again, from the Climate Board, but it's mainly resting between the energy policy that DEFRA is going to produce and the Manx Utilities. Obviously, they are charged with putting 30 megawatts of renewable energy generation on the island by 2026, well, a minimum of 20. They're saying they think they can achieve 30 with 20 megawatts of wind and 10 megawatts of solar. To do that and to be able to support increasing amounts of renewables on our network requires a second interconnector to balance. And then we need to look at how we generate the baseload. And I assure you that that is something that has been exercising us, that we are looking at, but it's in conjunction with the bodies that are going to be responsible for delivering that. But in our trilemma, the energy trilemma, along with security, independence, is the cost. So all of this has to be what is an achievable, affordable cost of power, and what is the best way to deliver it for the island. And it will be an interesting debate, but there are many offices in those established departments and Manx Utilities who've been looking at that for years. How secure is our energy at the minute when you consider the geopolitical landscape?
That was Daphne Caine, MHK. Is government all talk and no action? Has government made any meaningful progress, or is it all just warm words and jam tomorrow? Do we still have a climate crisis? If so, why are we still waiting for significant action? Perhaps you think it's all a big hoax and inaction is a good thing. Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. That's all for this week. I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.